Evening all. Okay, there's a lot to get through tonight, so without further ado, let's get busy. Right, this is number 2 on my list of 10 most effective people on the anti-left. And following up from number 3, Sargon of Akkad, tonight it is, I've been practicing this, hang on. Jordan Peterson and his struggle against those bloody Marxists. Man, life is difficult enough as it is when I'm doing this kind of strange, parallel hand signal and, those bloody Marxists. Right, anyway, that's out of the way. So, Jordan B. Peterson, a Canadian psychology professor who in the last 2 years has rocketed to international fame. He's currently on a worldwide tour, probably his second worldwide tour, as he goes into a third worldwide tour in 2019. Author of the best-selling book 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. How did a Canadian psychology professor, the man who has been described as the most influential thinker to come out of Canada since Marshall McLuhan, how has he done this? Why do so many people love hanging on his every word? And why do some people on the left absolutely detest and fear him? Well, I'm going to be looking into that. Now, I have read 12 Rules for Life, and I've been listening to his lecture series where he's been talking about religion, amongst other subjects. Frankly, I've watched so many hours of Jordan Peterson now. I'm only beginning to scratch the surface of his thinking and philosophy, and it's fascinating. Much like my number 3 entrant on the list, Sargon of Akkad, who I think is a citizen philosopher, a man, who has emerged onto the internet and part of the YouTube generation, self-made philosopher. But Peterson comes from a more traditional academic route, and he is perhaps the intellectual heft on my list. So, having read 12 Rules for Life and heard it mischaracterized over and over again by left-leaning journalists who see it's quite obvious they haven't gone far beyond chapter 1, because they keep mentioning chapter 1 and the whole thing about lobsters and hierarchy, and they never get to the other stuff in the book. Most of it is as absolutely fascinating psychological insight. What I think Peterson has done with the book and in his lecture tour is that he has seen how a lot of progressive left ideology has weakened the things that our culture and society have depended on. Ties of family, ties of community, the religious significance of within our culture. Even if people choose to be atheists, to be ignorant of the Judeo-Christian culture and values, and to scorn kind of metaphysical thinking, has led to a situation in recent years of people, particularly men, feeling alienated, feeling under pressure. The lives have become broken and fragmented. But the book, even though the press have been saying that it's this guidebook for men, a lot of the examples in the book of people whose lives have been fractured and have tried to set right are tales from women. So the idea that it's a male self-help book is erroneous, but that's not the only thing that the progressive left mischaracterize about Peterson and his work. Reading 12 Rules of Life, there are some very practical and I would say non-political points to be made. What I like about the way Peterson structures each chapter, it has come in for some criticism. Some people find it rambling. I don't, actually, because what I see Peterson doing is that he has the question, the point in the chapter title, the rule, and what he does is that he explains the journey to formulating that rule. And he has examples. He draws heavily from his casework and from his own personal life to not just pose the question, but to unpack the question before getting to the answer, getting to the point, and really pulling it apart. This is actually this is what postmodernism was supposed to do: pull things apart, analyze it, see what makes things tick, and then put it all back together again. The trouble with postmodernists is that they rarely put things back together again, and in a way where it functions afterwards. But this is what Peterson's advantage is with 12 Rules for Life, is that he can pick apart his questions and topics and then see what makes them tick, explain the journey, explain the thinking, the narrative behind each question, and then coming to the conclusion of why this rule is important in your life. Now, chapter 1 has the thing about hierarchies. These are things found in nature. This seems to annoy the left, but I think the real chapter that really takes on Marxist and postmodernist ideology is chapter 11, which is don't interrupt children from when they're skateboarding. And this is a chapter about the oppressiveness of Marxist and postmodernist thinking. You know, the desire to control people to the point where everything is no longer beautiful. He used the example of something that was at the University of Toronto, where teenagers, students would love to skateboard down these rails and down these steps, and then they put anti-skateboard devices on there to stop people from doing that. And instead of improving things, they actually made the campus environment look ugly in the process, all in this desire to stop people doing what they felt like doing. And this is where I think Peterson connects with such a large audience. He is telling people to take responsibility for themselves and to live lives of responsible freedom. You know, responsibility is a big thing with Peterson. And I wonder, why is the left really against this? Well, I think the nub of it comes down to who's taking responsibility, because Peterson has laid bare one of the truths about the progressive left is that they don't like people and they don't trust people. They don't trust people to come to their own conclusions, their own judgments, and to put their lives in order. There is something on the progressive left that looks at the human soul and just sees nothing but negative thoughts and feelings and impulses that need to be controlled by a kind of enlightened hierarchy of moral busybodies, and sort of controlling everybody's lives. And I think Peterson is challenging that notion, not that he is advocating for irresponsibility and he doesn't understand that there is a dark side to humanity. I think Peterson, more than a lot of other people that offer help to others and to put their lives in order, he doesn't shy away from the dark nature of humanity. I mean, he does a big chapter about pure evil, using the example of perhaps the most psychotic and evil murder in history, a man called Karl Panzram. And also, Peterson has studied totalitarianism, and he has seen how it has perverted and destroyed millions in its quest to advance its own ideals. So he is no stranger to this. And again, it's bizarre how people call him far right or in league with the alt-right, when he spends a lot of time warning against totalitarianism. And it's funny, in a time when the word fascist and far right is bandied around by people who don't know what either term means, and they don't know who is a real fascist or a real Nazi or a real far right person. Far right, what does it even mean? I mean, nobody can articulate it, but Peterson knows. Peterson knows what a fascist is. And he's trying to tell people, he's trying to warn people, and a lot of people are listening, and they're taking taking him to heart. They're inspired. I mean, this is what I think is amazing about some of the people on my list. People like Sargon of Akkad, Dave Rubin, and now Jordan Peterson. As the pinnacle of this, he's got people thinking deep thoughts. He's got people examining their lives and thinking, yes, what? How can I go deeper, further, more, be more responsible, be a genuine force for good in my world without having to oppress others and virtue signal and puff myself up. And he's got people he's got people who are diehard atheists going back and looking at the Judeo-Christian traditions and the traditions of religion and thinking, actually, no, I can learn a lot from this. There is wisdom of the ages. And I think Peterson's got to be applauded for that. And sticking up for free speech. He has been absolutely amazing at defending free speech, particularly in these confrontational interviews that he keeps having with journalists, and he's exposing the fallacy of journalistic technique that has been embedded in our culture for about 30 years now. And here I'm going to go off on a little tangent here, but this week the British newsreader Richard Baker died at age of 93. And Richard Baker was a newsreader when I was a very small child, but he wasn't a journalist. The newsreaders of my childhood from the 1950s through to about 1980 were not journalists. They were hired because of their ability to speak clearly and to speak in a manner where they could impart information very clearly. So you had journalists and news editors writing the stories so that people like Richard Baker, Kenneth Kendall, Gordon Honeycomb, Robert Dougal, all these people, they could just present the news as a matter of fact. And then later in the 80s, the journalists took over and they started putting in their inflections and their tones, sometimes approving, sometimes disapproving. And it led to this confrontational style of interview where the interviewer would decide in advance uh, whether they were going to be hostile to their subject even before the conversation started. And you'd have interruptions, and the famous Kathy Newman moment where her trick of misrepresenting something someone said in order to get them flustered was completely undone. So what you're saying is, it's now entered the widespread vernacular. So what you're saying is a metaphor for sloppy, lazy, disingenuous journalism that only seeks point scoring at the expense of truth and fairness and actually listening to the other person. That is another thing, that a rule that Peterson has in his book. Assume that the person you're talking to knows more than you do. And that is the rule that he is espousing whenever he has these interviews. And he's laying bare their trickery that they've learned. And we can all see it. The audience can see that it's all a sham, these type of confrontational interviews where it's all about point scoring. And if your subject seems to be making a coherent point, then you have to interrupt them. You have to divert them in mid-flow. And Peterson is brilliant at that, but it takes a lot of effort. And what I love about Peterson as well is that when he's in an in-depth interview or when he's answering questions from people in an audience, when he's giving a talk, is that sometimes you see the thought process is action. People say he rambles, but I don't think so. What's happening there is that the thought processes are evident in motion. You're watching his thought process. If he seems like he's rambling, it's because he's unpacking the question, examining it right before our eyes, before coming to the answer, the conclusion. And I find this fascinating. That's what makes him compelling. And I think this is what a lot of people find compelling about him, is that this isn't showmanship. This is seeing the intellectual process happening, unfolding, developing as he answers these questions. And I think this is a large part of his appeal and his thoughtfulness. But you can tell a confrontational interview takes a lot out of him. Not only does he have to defend himself, defend his work, but you can see that it is wearying. He sometimes pauses for seconds before coming up with his answer because he wants to get everything right. It's another rule: be precise in your speech. And he is following his examples. And this is the other thing about the book and about the man, is that you can see that he is following his own rules, or he's doing his best to follow his own rules in the best way that he can. And so Peterson has become the intellectual heft of, call it the right, call it the center, just call it ordinary human beings. He is their new intellectual hero, in a way that we had intellectual heroes back when I was growing up. We had Carl Sagan, we had Kenneth Clark, James Burke. We had great thinkers just there for our popular edification and entertainment. And 12 Rules for Life, I think, is our generation's equivalent of A Brief History of Time. Our Brief History of Time in the 1990s was the must-have book for everyone who just wanted to stretch their minds out a little bit more. And I think 12 Rules for Life is a successor. And this is what I think the left hate. They don't want to understand him because he challenges the narrative. They don't want to admit that he may be right on a few points, because if he is right on a few points, then we as individuals are more empowered than the big state, the all-knowing, the all-powerful state, looking down, telling us what to say, telling us what to think, rewriting our history, rewriting our culture, and even tampering with known scientific fact. And so, Dr. Peterson, if you ever see this, I salute you. Keep up the good work. And in a few days' time, I'll be revealing who my number one person, the number one most effective person on the anti-left. You've probably guessed already. A conspicuous name not on the list yet. But until then, I'll see you later. This is Nick Hughes. I'll see you out there on internet land. And until then, good night.